I once heard an old elder say that the cruelest wedding is not the one without love, but the one where only one heart is still beating. On the coldest morning anyone could remember, the bells of Blackstone Kingdom echoed across snow-covered mountains as if they were mourning a king who would never hear them again. Frost clung to every stone wall, every pine branch, and every silent rooftop while hungry villagers gathered outside the ancient chapel with hollow eyes and quiet prayers. Winter had stolen their harvest, sickness had claimed the strongest workers, and the remaining food would barely last another week. The kingdom had promised aid only under one impossible condition. Olivia Carter, a 24-year-old Omega from the forgotten mountain village of Ash Hollow, stood alone at the chapel entrance wearing a simple ivory wedding gown borrowed from the village church. It was beautiful enough for a celebration, yet painfully out of place beneath the heavy gray sky and among faces marked by fear instead of joy. Her hands trembled inside white wool gloves, not because of the freezing wind but because she knew every step she took would change her life forever. The royal decree had arrived 3 days earlier, carried by exhausted messengers riding through the snow. King Alpha Ethan Blackwood had fallen during a distant campaign months before, and although his body had finally been returned to Blackstone Castle, ancient royal law declared that the kingdom could only fulfill an unfinished covenant through a ceremonial marriage before the late king could be laid to rest with honor. In exchange, the royal treasury would release enough grain, medicine, blankets, livestock, and seed to rescue any village willing to provide the ceremonial bride. Every noble family refused. Every wealthy merchant found an excuse. Every neighboring town remained silent. Only Ash Hollow accepted the burden because refusing meant watching children starve before spring arrived. Olivia had volunteered before anyone else could speak. She remembered the frightened faces of the children she taught to read, the elderly widow who always shared her last loaf of bread, and the young blacksmith who had worked through the night repairing farming tools that nobody had the strength to use. She could not watch them disappear while she still had something to offer. Her father begged her to reconsider. Her closest friends cried through the night. Even the village pastor admitted that he wished another path existed. Olivia listened with gentle eyes and thanked each of them, yet her decision never changed. She believed that courage was not the absence of fear but the willingness to carry it for someone else. As the royal carriage arrived beneath fluttering banners bearing the silver wolf crest, the crowd stepped aside in complete silence. No music played. No joyful cheers welcomed the bride. Only the steady sound of church bells floated through the frozen air while snowflakes drifted softly around the black carriage waiting to carry her toward Blackstone Castle. Olivia took one final look at the village she loved, memorizing every chimney, every narrow path, every familiar face, then offered a peaceful smile that somehow comforted everyone except herself. She climbed into the carriage knowing she was leaving behind the only life she had ever known, unaware that destiny had quietly begun rewriting every page of her future, because somewhere beyond the endless white mountains, the man the entire kingdom believed had died was still drawing breath. The journey to Blackstone Castle lasted 2 long days through endless forests buried beneath fresh snow and frozen rivers that shimmered beneath pale winter sunlight. Olivia spent most of the journey watching the quiet landscape pass beyond the carriage window, wondering whether the people of Ash Hollow had already begun receiving the grain and medicine promised by the royal decree. That single thought became the only comfort she allowed herself. Every mile carried her farther from the home she loved and closer to a future she could neither imagine nor escape. By the afternoon of the second day, the towering walls of Blackstone Castle emerged through drifting white mist like an ancient fortress carved directly from the mountains themselves. Massive stone towers reached toward the gray sky while silver banners bearing the royal wolf crest moved gently in the icy wind. Hundreds of royal guards stood silently along the entrance, their polished armor reflecting the cold winter light. Servants opened the enormous oak gates without celebration, and the carriage rolled slowly across the snow-dusted courtyard where every sound seemed softened by the heavy silence surrounding the castle. Olivia stepped down carefully, her ivory gown brushing against the frozen stone beneath her feet. Waiting for her were the High Chancellor, several members of the Royal Council, elderly priests, and dozens of servants whose respectful expressions revealed curiosity rather than warmth. None of them smiled. None of them offered congratulations. This was not the arrival of a joyful bride but the fulfillment of an ancient covenant. The High Chancellor greeted her with a gentle bow before quietly thanking her for the sacrifice she had accepted on behalf of the kingdom. Without unnecessary ceremony, he guided her through magnificent corridors illuminated by thousands of candles whose golden light danced across polished marble floors and towering stained glass windows. Every hallway displayed portraits of past Alpha Kings whose steady eyes seemed to follow each visitor passing beneath them. Eventually the procession entered the great cathedral at the heart of the castle. The vast chamber glowed softly beneath countless candles arranged around an elevated platform where a royal coffin rested beneath an embroidered navy banner decorated with the silver wolf crest. Fresh white flowers surrounded the casket, and the peaceful stillness inside the cathedral felt almost sacred. Olivia approached slowly until she stood before the coffin containing the man she had never met yet was expected to marry according to centuries of royal tradition. The elderly priest opened an ancient book and began reciting the ceremonial vows that bound kingdoms, families, and history together. Olivia listened quietly before speaking each promise with steady courage, her voice never trembling despite the impossible sadness surrounding the moment. When the vows ended, the High Chancellor respectfully placed the royal signet ring into her hand. After a brief pause, Olivia slipped the ring onto her own finger, completing the final requirement of the covenant. Throughout the cathedral, every noble lowered their head while the great bells of Blackstone echoed across the kingdom. At that very same moment, royal supply wagons loaded with grain, blankets, livestock, medicine, and seed departed through the castle gates toward Ash Hollow, fulfilling every promise made to her village. As the ceremony concluded, the royal council formally addressed Olivia as queen, though the title felt strangely distant within the silent cathedral. She accepted it with quiet humility, asking only one question before leaving. "Have the wagons already departed for my village?" The High Chancellor smiled for the first time that day. "Yes, Your Majesty." They left before the ceremony ended. Relief softened Olivia's eyes. She did not ask about royal chambers, jewels, or privilege. Knowing that children in Ash Hollow would sleep with full stomachs that night was enough. Yet as she followed the servants deeper into the castle, she never noticed the lone exhausted rider crossing a distant northern mountain pass beneath the fading winter sky, carrying the same silver wolf crest upon his weathered cloak while unknowingly riding home toward the life everyone believed he had already lost. 3 peaceful weeks passed beneath the gray skies of late winter, and life inside Blackstone Castle slowly settled into a quiet rhythm. Although the ancient ceremony had granted Olivia the title of queen, she refused to spend her days surrounded by luxury while the kingdom was still recovering from hardship. Every morning she walked through the castle kitchens to ensure extra bread was prepared for orphanages, visited the royal infirmary to speak with healers caring for the elderly, and spent long hours studying maps with the High Chancellor to identify villages still waiting for supplies. Servants quickly noticed that the young queen remembered every name she heard, thanked every worker who crossed her path, and often carried food to tired guards before remembering to eat herself. The people inside the castle gradually stopped seeing her as the stranger who had arrived from a forgotten mountain village. Instead, they began speaking quietly about the kindness that seemed to follow her wherever she walked. Far beyond the northern border, however, another journey was approaching its end. A lone rider guided his exhausted black horse along a narrow mountain road where melting snow revealed patches of frozen earth beneath the first signs of approaching spring. His once polished silver armor carried the marks of countless miles traveled through wilderness, while the dark navy cloak fastened across his shoulders still displayed the unmistakable royal wolf crest. His face looked older than when he had first departed months earlier, not because of age but because long hardship had quietly reshaped every expression. King Alpha Ethan Blackwood had survived an ambush that scattered his companions deep within the northern mountains, where injured survivors were forced to remain hidden through the harshest weeks of winter before finally finding a safe route home. Without knowing it, he had spent months riding toward a kingdom that had already buried his memory beneath royal tradition. As dawn broke on the 22nd morning after Olivia's arrival, the northern watchtower guard narrowed his eyes while scanning the distant road stretching through the valley. At first he believed the approaching rider to be another traveling merchant. Then sunlight reflected across familiar silver armor. The guard froze before lifting a brass spyglass with trembling hands. One long silent moment passed. Then another. Suddenly the heavy warning horn echoed across the entire castle, its powerful sound rolling over rooftops, towers, gardens, and frozen courtyards. Guards rushed toward the walls. Servants abandoned their work. Members of the royal council hurried from the meeting chamber while confused villagers gathered outside the gates. Olivia stepped onto a stone balcony overlooking the entrance courtyard just as the enormous oak gates slowly opened. The lone rider crossed beneath the towering archway at an unhurried pace before gently bringing his weary horse to a stop. Snowflakes drifted through the still morning air as he reached up, removed the hood covering his face, and revealed piercing blue eyes that every portrait inside Blackstone Castle had preserved with remarkable accuracy. An elderly captain standing nearest the gate dropped to one knee before anyone else could move. "Welcome home, Your Majesty," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. One by one, every guard followed. Silence spread through the courtyard like falling snow. Olivia remained motionless upon the marble staircase, her fingers resting unconsciously against the royal signet ring upon her hand. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward the woman standing beneath the royal banner. He saw an unfamiliar young Omega wearing the ring that belonged only to the Queen of Blackstone, and quiet confusion crossed his face. In that single breathless moment, neither of them realized that the impossible story which had begun with sacrifice was only now beginning to reveal its true destiny. The courtyard remained completely silent long after the castle gates had closed behind Ethan Blackwood. Even the restless winter wind seemed unwilling to disturb the impossible moment unfolding beneath the towering stone walls. Olivia slowly descended the marble staircase, her ivory gown moving gently with each careful step while the royal signet ring reflected the pale afternoon light. She stopped several feet away from the man whose portrait had watched over every hallway inside the castle since the day she arrived. Ethan looked at her with quiet confusion rather than suspicion. His attention settled briefly upon the royal ring before returning to her calm hazel eyes. Neither of them spoke until the High Chancellor stepped forward with measured dignity. The elderly statesman bowed deeply before the king, relief filling every line upon his weathered face. With patient honesty, he explained everything that had happened during Ethan's absence. The kingdom had believed its king had fallen beyond the northern frontier. Ancient royal law required the unfinished covenant to be fulfilled before the throne could pass peacefully into the future. Every noble family had refused the ceremonial marriage. Only one young woman from the mountain village of Ash Hollow had willingly accepted the burden after learning that her people would receive enough food and medicine to survive the winter. Ethan listened without interrupting. His expression never hardened. When the Chancellor quietly explained that Olivia had never asked for wealth, privilege, or power, but had spoken only one question after the ceremony, asking whether the supply wagons had already departed for her village, something almost imperceptible changed inside the king's eyes. He turned toward Olivia once more. She lowered her gaze respectfully before speaking with gentle honesty. She explained that she had never expected to meet him because everyone believed he was gone forever. She apologized if her presence inside Blackstone Castle had caused confusion and quietly added that she would willingly surrender every royal title if doing so would restore peace to the kingdom. Ethan studied her face carefully, searching for pride, ambition, or hidden calculation, yet finding none. Instead he saw only sincerity, quiet exhaustion, and a kindness untouched by circumstance. Before anyone could respond, several servants hurried across the courtyard carrying baskets filled with fresh bread, blankets, and medicine. Olivia immediately excused herself and walked toward them, asking whether the supplies had been prepared for the villages damaged by the recent snowstorm. She carefully lifted one of the baskets herself despite the servants insisting that it was unnecessary for the queen to carry such burdens. Ethan watched silently as she thanked every servant by name before helping load the wagons waiting outside the gates. None of her actions appeared performed for admiration because she seemed completely unaware that the king himself was observing every quiet gesture. The royal council members exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected anger, accusations, or confusion after Ethan's return. Instead, the courtyard remained filled only with thoughtful silence. As the final wagon departed toward the western villages, Ethan finally broke the silence with a calm voice that carried across the stone courtyard. He thanked Olivia for protecting his people when he could. Not. The words were simple, yet every guard, servant, and council member immediately understood their meaning. The impossible tension that had filled Blackstone Castle since his arrival softened without anyone noticing exactly when it had begun to fade. Above the castle towers, the heavy winter clouds slowly parted for the first time in weeks, allowing a narrow beam of warm sunlight to fall across the ancient courtyard while both strangers quietly realized that the future before them would no longer be written by ancient laws alone, but by the choices they would make together from this day forward. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm unlike anything Blackstone Castle had experienced in years. Spring slowly began loosening winter's grip, and thin streams of melting snow wound through the gardens beyond the castle walls while the first green leaves appeared upon ancient oak branches. Ethan returned to the responsibilities waiting inside the royal council chamber, yet he found his thoughts repeatedly drawn toward the young queen whose actions never seemed to match the assumptions many nobles had quietly formed. Rather than relying upon reports prepared by advisors, he decided to see the truth with his own eyes. Without announcing his intentions, he occasionally observed Olivia from a respectful distance as she carried out the ordinary routines that filled every hour of her day. Before sunrise she walked through the royal kitchens, thanking the cooks preparing bread for nearby orphanages before gently reminding them to reserve extra portions for families arriving from distant villages. She visited the infirmary every morning, speaking with elderly patients as though each conversation mattered more than the royal schedule waiting elsewhere inside the castle. When children became frightened by unfamiliar surroundings, she knelt beside them until their smiles returned, never realizing that guards standing nearby quietly smiled as well. Ethan noticed something even more unusual. Every servant seemed genuinely happy whenever Olivia entered a room. Housekeepers spoke freely with her without fear. Stable workers greeted her as if she had always belonged among them. Gardeners proudly showed her the first flowers blooming after the long winter, and she celebrated each blossom with the same sincere joy others might reserve for royal victories. One afternoon Ethan followed at a distance as Olivia quietly left the castle through the western gate carrying only a small basket filled with fresh bread, herbal remedies, and sewing supplies. She walked nearly 2 miles along a winding country road until she reached a small cottage where an elderly widow lived alone after losing her family several winters earlier. Olivia repaired a torn blanket beside the fireplace, prepared a simple meal, and listened patiently while the woman shared stories from decades past. When she finally departed before sunset, she left the basket behind without mentioning it. The elderly woman stood in the doorway wiping grateful tears from her cheeks long after Olivia disappeared down the quiet road. Ethan remained hidden beneath the shade of tall pine trees, realizing that nobody else had witnessed the moment except himself. There had been no audience, no council members, no expectation of recognition. It was simply the kind of person Olivia had always chosen to be. During the following week similar moments revealed themselves again and again. She organized apprenticeships for young craftsmen whose families had lost everything during the harsh winter. She convinced wealthy merchants to reduce prices until every village could purchase seed before planting season. She encouraged royal scribes to establish schools in remote communities where children had never learned to read. Everywhere she went, people seemed lighter after she left. One evening, as golden sunlight settled across the castle gardens, Ethan found Olivia carefully watering newly planted white roses with several young gardeners. She laughed softly when one little girl accidentally splashed water across the hem of her gown, then helped the embarrassed child finish the work together. Watching from across the stone pathway, Ethan finally understood that the kingdom had not been saved only by the sacrifice Olivia made on the day of the ceremony. It was being quietly restored every single day afterward by the compassion she continued giving without ever asking for anything in return, and for the first time since returning home, he wondered whether destiny had been far wiser than ancient tradition had ever intended. The first warm winds of spring carried a quiet sense of renewal across Blackstone Kingdom, softening the last traces of winter that still lingered beneath the castle walls. Streams flowed freely once again, fields slowly awakened beneath pale green shoots, and villages that had once feared another season of hunger began preparing their land for planting. Ethan decided that reports written upon parchment were no longer enough. If the kingdom was truly healing, he wanted to witness it with his own eyes. Instead of traveling with a grand royal procession, he chose a small escort, and to the surprise of nearly everyone inside the castle, he personally invited Olivia to accompany him. She accepted with the same gentle smile she offered to everyone, never treating the invitation as a privilege but simply another opportunity to help wherever she was needed. Their journey carried them through villages scattered among rolling hills, dense forests, and quiet valleys where ordinary families welcomed them with gratitude instead of ceremony. Ethan noticed that Olivia never hurried through a greeting. She listened carefully to every farmer describing damaged crops, every teacher explaining the needs of village children, and every elderly resident recalling difficult winters that had shaped their lives. Rather than making promises beyond her reach, she carefully recorded each concern before discussing practical solutions with local leaders. Ethan admired how naturally people trusted her. They did not speak to her because she wore the title of queen. They spoke because they believed she truly cared about every answer she received. One afternoon they arrived at a riverside village where spring flooding had damaged a wooden bridge connecting several farms to the marketplace. Merchants worried about delayed deliveries while children faced a long journey to reach the village school. Before the royal engineers could even present their recommendations, Olivia quietly walked across the muddy riverbank, speaking with local carpenters and examining the damaged supports herself. She suggested rebuilding the bridge slightly farther upstream where stronger stone foundations already existed, allowing the structure to withstand future floods more effectively. The master builder studied the landscape before smiling with genuine admiration. He admitted that her idea would require less lumber, reduce construction time, and better protect the village for many years. Ethan watched the entire conversation without interrupting. He realized that Olivia never attempted to appear important. She simply focused upon helping people solve problems together. As the days passed, they shared more conversations during long carriage rides beneath blooming trees and endless blue skies. Ethan learned about Olivia's childhood in Ash Hollow, where neighbors survived difficult seasons only by sharing what little they possessed. Olivia listened as Ethan described the responsibilities he had carried since inheriting the throne at a young age and the loneliness that often accompanied leadership. Neither conversation felt forced. The quiet distance that had once existed between them gradually disappeared, replaced by mutual respect built through countless ordinary moments. One evening they paused atop a gentle hillside overlooking fields where farmers planted the first crops of spring beneath the fading golden light. Families laughed together while children chased one another between rows of newly turned soil. Olivia stood silently beside Ethan, watching the peaceful scene below. After several moments, Ethan quietly admitted that he had expected to spend the journey teaching her about the kingdom. Instead, he said with a grateful smile, she had shown him parts of his own people he had never truly learned to see. Olivia lowered her eyes modestly before answering that the kingdom had always belonged to its people, and that rulers simply carried the responsibility of protecting what already mattered most. Ethan looked across the valley once more, understanding that every mile they had traveled together had transformed more than the land recovering. Beneath the warmth of spring. Without either of them speaking the words aloud, trust had quietly taken root between two hearts that fate had first joined through sacrifice but was now allowing to grow through genuine choice. Several peaceful weeks passed after their journey across the kingdom, and the quiet changes unfolding inside Blackstone Castle became impossible for anyone to ignore. The distance that had once separated Ethan and Olivia no longer existed, yet neither of them hurried to define the bond that had slowly grown between them. Respect had arrived before affection, and trust had taken root long before either heart understood what it was quietly becoming. Every evening they met inside the castle library after the final council session, reviewing village reports beside tall windows where the fading sunlight painted warm golden patterns across shelves filled with centuries of royal history. Their conversations no longer centered only upon harvests, bridges, or trade routes. Ethan found himself asking about Olivia's dreams for the children growing up in remote villages, while Olivia became curious about the burdens Ethan had carried since inheriting the throne while still so young. They spoke honestly because neither feared being misunderstood. One calm evening near the beginning of summer, Ethan invited Olivia to walk through the royal gardens after sunset. The air carried the gentle fragrance of blooming white roses planted during the first weeks of spring, while small lanterns illuminated winding stone paths leading toward an ancient fountain that had stood inside the castle grounds for generations. They walked side by side beneath towering oak trees without speaking for several moments, listening only to the peaceful sound of flowing water and distant birds settling into the evening sky. Finally Ethan stopped beside the fountain and turned toward her with quiet sincerity. He admitted that every day since his return had forced him to reconsider everything he believed about duty, destiny, and the ancient traditions governing the kingdom. He explained that although the ceremonial marriage had fulfilled the law, he refused to let old customs decide Olivia's future any longer. From inside his cloak he carefully removed a folded parchment bearing the royal seal. It was an official decree, already signed and witnessed by the royal council. Ethan placed it gently into Olivia's hands. The document declared that the ceremonial marriage could be peacefully dissolved without dishonor to either family or kingdom. She would remain free to return to Ash Hollow, continue serving Blackstone in any role she wished, or begin an entirely new life elsewhere. Every title, responsibility, and expectation would become her choice alone. Ethan looked directly into her eyes before speaking words that no king had ever expected to say under such circumstances. He told her that gratitude could never become the foundation of love, and sacrifice should never become a lifelong obligation. If she stayed beside him, he wanted it to be because her own heart freely desired that future, not because ancient laws had written it for her months before. Olivia lowered her eyes as she quietly unfolded the parchment. For a long moment she said nothing. The soft evening breeze gently lifted loose strands of her chestnut hair while tears slowly gathered within her hazel eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that someone had finally placed her own happiness before every tradition, expectation, and political necessity. She looked toward the castle, remembering the frightened young woman who had arrived believing her future had already been decided forever. Then she looked back at Ethan, whose expression held only patience and quiet respect. Before answering, she carefully folded the decree once again and held it close against her heart. In that silent moment beneath the warm summer sky, neither destiny nor ancient law waited for her decision. For the very first time in her life, the path ahead belonged entirely to her, and Ethan understood that whatever answer she eventually gave would be the first truly honest beginning either of them had ever received. The following morning dawned beneath a brilliant summer sky unlike any Blackstone had seen in many years. Warm sunlight poured across the castle towers, filling every courtyard, garden, and stone pathway with golden light that seemed to promise a new beginning. Olivia spent the night carefully considering the parchment Ethan had placed into her hands. The decree still rested upon the small wooden table beside her window, untouched except for the gentle crease where she had folded it herself. It represented complete freedom, something she had never expected to receive after accepting the ancient covenant that had changed her life forever. Yet as she watched villagers gathering below the castle walls, listening to children laugh while merchants prepared colorful market stalls for the day's trade, she quietly realized that the answer had already been growing inside her heart long before Ethan had spoken those unexpected words beside the fountain. Later that morning she requested a private meeting inside the royal library where tall windows overlooked gardens filled with blooming white roses. Ethan arrived without attendance, believing she had made her decision. Before he could speak, Olivia carefully placed the unopened royal decree back into his hands. With gentle honesty she explained that she no longer wished to remain because of duty, gratitude, or ancient law. She wished to stay because somewhere between frozen winters, quiet journeys, shared responsibilities, and countless ordinary conversations, Blackstone had become her home and Ethan had become the person she trusted more deeply than anyone else in the world. She smiled softly before adding that the first ceremony had saved a kingdom, but it had never truly united two hearts. If they were to walk into the future together, she wanted a beginning chosen freely by both of them. Ethan looked at her in complete silence before a warm smile slowly appeared across his face, carrying more peace than triumph. Within days the royal council announced that a new ceremony would be held, not to satisfy forgotten tradition but to celebrate a union willingly embraced by both the king and the queen. The announcement spread quickly across every village. Families who had survived the harsh winter because of Olivia's sacrifice traveled to Blackstone carrying handmade gifts, fresh flowers, woven blankets, and baskets filled with the first fruits of summer. Farmers decorated wagons with wildflowers while children practiced songs they hoped to sing outside the cathedral. On the morning of the ceremony, sunlight streamed through magnificent stained glass windows, painting brilliant colors across polished marble floors lined with white blossoms and fresh greenery. Ethan waited beneath the ancient royal crest wearing an elegant navy ceremonial cloak embroidered with silver thread, his expression calm, grateful, and filled with quiet happiness. Moments later the cathedral doors opened, and Olivia entered wearing a graceful ivory gown whose simple elegance reflected everything she had always been. There was no fear within her eyes this time, only peaceful certainty. As she reached the altar, Ethan extended his hand, not as a king exercising authority but as a man offering his future to someone he deeply respected. Olivia accepted without hesitation. Together they exchanged new vows, promising not only loyalty to the kingdom but kindness, honesty, patience, and the freedom to continue choosing one another every day that followed. When the final blessing echoed through the cathedral, joyful bells rang across Blackstone, flower petals drifted through the warm summer breeze, and every face watching the ceremony reflected the same quiet truth. Their first marriage had been born from sacrifice, but this one had been born from love freely given, and in that unforgettable moment the entire kingdom understood that the strongest promises are never demanded by destiny because they are willingly spoken by two hearts that have already found their way home. Years passed, and the story that had once begun beneath a sky filled with snow and uncertainty quietly became the foundation of a new era for Blackstone Kingdom. The people no longer remembered that season only as the winter when their king disappeared. Instead, they remembered it as the winter when one young Omega chose the lives of others before her own future, and how that single act of courage changed the destiny of an entire nation. Every spring thereafter, orchards planted during Ethan and Olivia's first years together burst into bloom across the valleys. Schools stood where abandoned buildings had once crumbled beneath heavy snow. Fresh wells brought clean water to distant mountain villages, while sturdy bridges connected communities that had once remained isolated for generations. Merchants traveled safely through roads lined with thriving farms, and laughter gradually replaced the silence that hardship had left behind. Yet despite the prosperity surrounding them, little changed about the two people who guided the kingdom. Ethan still preferred walking through the marketplace without unnecessary ceremony, greeting craftsmen, shepherds, and children by name before beginning each day inside the council chamber. Olivia continued visiting orphanages, village schools, and country clinics without announcing her arrival, believing that the smallest kindness often carried the greatest meaning. Servants often smiled because the queen still thanked every cook, gardener, stable worker, and housekeeper with the same sincere warmth she had shown on her very first day inside the castle. One bright autumn afternoon, Ethan suggested returning to Ash Hollow, the village where everything had quietly begun. Together they traveled through familiar forests whose leaves shimmered with brilliant shades of gold and crimson beneath a clear blue sky. As they approached the village square, they discovered a place transformed beyond recognition. Children ran freely through clean streets lined with sturdy homes, fresh harvests filled wooden market stalls, and smoke rose peacefully from every chimney. The elderly widow whom Olivia had once worried about now welcomed them with homemade bread and joyful tears, while the little children she had taught years before had grown into young teachers, healers, carpenters, and farmers serving their own community. Near the village entrance stood two magnificent oak trees planted shortly after the first royal supply wagons had arrived. Their branches stretched high above the road, offering shade to every traveler entering the valley. Ethan gently rested one hand upon the rough bark before smiling toward Olivia. He quietly admitted that he had once believed kingdoms were protected only by strength, strategy, and ancient law. Olivia looked across the peaceful village before softly answering that kingdoms survived because ordinary people never stopped choosing kindness when life became difficult. As evening settled across the mountains, golden sunlight slowly disappeared beyond the distant horizon while church bells echoed gently through the valley. Families gathered together for supper, children laughed beneath the towering oak trees, and the peaceful kingdom reflected everything Ethan and Olivia had worked to protect. Standing side by side beneath the warm autumn sky, they understood that the greatest miracle had never been one man's unexpected return. The true miracle had been every quiet decision made afterward, every burden shared together, every stranger treated with dignity, and every act of compassion that slowly healed hearts across the kingdom. Long after future generations forgot the details of ancient ceremonies and royal decrees, they continued telling one unforgettable story about a humble Omega who chose sacrifice without expecting reward, a wise King Alpha who chose love without demanding obligation, and a kingdom that discovered its greatest strength would always be found in mercy, hope, and the freedom to choose one another.